Minecraft's had 5 mob votes over the years, and sure, we got some great mobs out of them, but for every winner there were a bunch of absolute losers. So today I'm reviving every rejected mob idea in the only way I can, building them all in creative mode. Now I've done this before in a previous video with every Minecraft boss and it went pretty well, but I've learned from that project, instead of cramming everything into one big scene, each mob will get its own custom podium to stand proudly on top of. And just like that bosses video, I'll be building these in my realistic style. Starting with the 2017 mob vote, we had 3 mobs that were never added. The first mob was the Barnacle. This mob looked like a squid with a massive mouth and a long tongue it used to snatch its prey. I started by shaping the body, then I added the 4 big mouth parts, and then I added tentacles and fins to give it that squid-like silhouette. I used real-life references of squids to get an idea of their general anatomy, which I tried to recreate with the shapes here. And once finished, I began texturing with some commands, replacing the base to a cyan color and using the shadow command to place the larger shadows, finishing it off with glowing eyes on both sides. I started to really refine the texturing here, using lighter cyan blocks to highlight the edges and darker green blocks to give the entire build some depth. I wanted to get most of the base coloring done so I could move on to the next step. Inside its mouth, I added rows of sharp teeth, smoothing them out with stairs for extra detail. It was pretty tedious building each individual tooth, having to build them in similar sizes while keeping them evenly spaced apart. But all in all, I think I did a pretty decent job. Once I finished 2 rows of teeth, I copied them over and flipped them to the other side, fixing some small errors from the rotation, which sped up the process a lot. This is when I went back in using stairs, slabs, and other detail blocks to sharpen them and give them a more refined final appearance. Not only did I do this for the teeth, but I also went back to the squid's body to stair slab the rest of it. As I'm sure you've noticed, I do this for all my builds to make them look that much more real. I even went ahead and used slabs to make the tongue smooth as well. When I was happy with the shape and coloring of the squid, it was time to finish this build off. To sell the underwater effect, I placed bubbles, seagrass, and tiny pebbles around the podium, swapping the top block palette to sand. I didn't want the podium to outshine the main build, so I tried to keep it pretty simple, creating some basic terrain and using the spike tool to add little patches of seagrass here and there. This was a small step, but it really helps bring the entire build together, making it one giant cohesive piece. Finally, I added small pebbles and stones, just like you'd see at the bottom of the sea, and I also decided to give the podium some shadows and added little patches of sand going down the side. With that done, we had our first mob. I'm super happy with how that came out. Next, the hovering Inferno, which was pretty much a blaze with shields circling its body. For its core, I built a skull-like head because I didn't know exactly what the blaze was made out of, and then I surrounded it with floating shields. I did this by building one individual shield and duplicated into 4 rotated copies. After pasting the 4 shields, I went back in to fix some small parts by hand, and then I replaced everything to a brighter yellow color. I mapped out some very basic shadows and highlights, and then I began work on the head. I decided to give the head 2 small eyeballs to make it as realistic to the original mob as possible. I then started detailing the rest, finishing it off to move on to the coloring. This mob didn't require too much texturing, just a simple yellow to orange gradient, which I ended up doing for the 4 floating shields around. And for the flames, I combined candles and glass for that glowing effect. I used different kinds of candles to sell that fire effect, which turned out really well when it was finished. Finally, for the mob, I used lots of glass to smooth out the colors and remove those shadows from the blocks. For the platform, it was only fitting to use nether bricks, and I used a very similar side design as the last one, adding little glowing parts to make it really pop. And then I gave its podium a cracked molten rock style with lava flowing through the gaps, finishing off this fiery mob. Lastly, I gave it some smoke particles and ash floating around, and then added some final details to the podium. With that, we had our blaze finished and one more mob ticked off the list. Finally, for the 2017 mob vote, we had the Great Hunger. This one had a simple but cute design. I built its base out of multiple rectangles, and then I shaped it a little further so it isn't too blocky. I added its little teeth on the top and bottom of its mouth, and then I shaped the rest of its body just a little bit more. I found a bunch of different textures online, but I decided to texture it as a grass block, as this mob sinks into the ground and camouflages itself, patiently waiting for its prey. I covered it with green concrete powder to make it look like grass, and even used some leaves as well. This mob was a lot simpler, so I could already move on to the last step. Finally, I smoothed it out and gave the platform a grassy look too, using glass to create the blades of grass on top. I added some dirt on the sides and some moss on the podium, finishing off our little friend here. Now that we finished the 2017 mob vote, let's move on to the 2020 mob vote. Beginning with the Moobloom, a cow covered in flowers, this was many people's favorite mob, and I mean, just look at it. How can you hate it? I began by shaping the cow's body, then retextured it in a bright yellow, adding a few white spots around its body. When I was happy with the texture, I began with some simple shading and texturing, using glass once more to blend all the colors together, and smooth out all the little imperfections, making the colors really pop. I then decorated its back and added its signature blooming flowers on top. I also did something similar for the podium, decorating it in small daisy flowers. As I built and pasted the last few flowers in, I have to say, this one was definitely one of my favorites as well, and I was really happy with how it came out. Now let's move on to the next mob. The Iceologer was the one I was most excited about. I wanted to really give him a dramatic pose, and then I dressed him in a thick blue robe. I mainly did this using the loft tool, and then I began sculpting little creases and folds here and there, giving it a flowing in the wind looking effect. I added on the head and the hood on top, and then I moved on to detailing the hands and replaced all the placeholders to their original colors. I added on some fingers, and when I was happy with one hand, I copied it over and flipped it to the other arm as well. I did some simple color replacing to the rest of the body, and once that was done, I decided to move on to detailing the face, adding in some eyes, giving him an angry facial expression. For his cape, I made a large selection with the loft tool and designed it with its iconic snowflake symbol at the back. Some light shading and smoothing, and then I decided to recreate his ice attack ability. For the ice itself, it was going to be pretty simple, using layered glass blocks to form this cool semi-transparent ice effect. I think it achieved the icy look really well. Lastly, I decorated the terrain with some snow and some icy spikes at the bottom. With that done, we had our Iceologer, just in time for the winter season, and another mob checked off the list. Now we were getting to the more recent mob votes. The 2021 mob vote actually only had one forgotten mob. In this vote, both the LA and the Copper Golem eventually made it into the game. Funnily enough, as I was working on this video, they decided to release the Copper Golem, so technically this build no longer fits into this video. So I've just decided to show you the final result here. The last mob that was left was the Glare. I first made an upside down teardrop shape, which I then flipped back down, and then I started by layering leaves onto the round shape, copy pasting small segments of leaves to speed up the process. I made sure to leave out a small gap which were going to hold the tiny eyes peeking through. I replaced the blocks to the respective colors, and I carved out a small space for the eyes. With some hidden lighting, the eyes stood out underneath the leaves. Finally, I went into the leaves and gave them some brighter highlights to really make them pop that much more. Then I did a little bit of stair slabbing to finish off the glare. And around the podium, I decided to add some grass, which I did using the same techniques as before, with green glass spikes scattered around the plot. This really pulls off the effect, and I even added some terracotta in there for good measure. And to add to the general composition, I give it some leaves blowing in the wind. I think the leaves give the whole scene a really dynamic look. I even decided to add glowberries at the bottom, just because I thought they fit the leafy vibe of this mob. Once I had finished one glowberry bush, I copied it and pasted it around the podium. I also think this one turned out really well. Let's move on to the next mob. Moving on to the 2022 mob vote, which gave us the Sniffer, leaving behind two mobs. The Tuff Golem was a simple but fun one, starting out with some rotated cubes and rectangles, and for its texture I used a noise pattern to get that stony cracked effect, which I replaced with walls later on. I added some sea lanterns into the eyes, giving them a subtle glow, then I gave it its iconic red and yellow robe. This mob was one of the easier ones to make, and was very similar to the Copper Golem when it came to the actual building process. As I was finishing off the robe and details, the mob was almost done and it was time to decorate the platform. For the platform, I also went with a noise pattern, giving it a simple cobblestone look. I also shaded the sides with the same pattern I used for the previous build, keeping things unique but consistent. The Rascal had a hunchback goblin-like appearance, carrying a backpack full of treasures. This mob was the most complicated one to interpret for me, as I couldn't tell exactly what it was. I built it with a rough posture, then gave it some shorts and its torn hoodie on top. This gave it a really mysterious, kinda spooky vibe. I gave it a simple brown backpack using rectangles molded together and the loft tool once more for the straps. I got started on the minor details such as the face and the little torn pieces on the clothing. Using different shades of cyan and light blue, I shaded the clothes and then I gave it its little toes and fingers. I added some patches and stitching lines on the hoodie for a worn down look. For the final touches, I gave the floor a stony look and then I added some ores underneath. Since this mob was supposed to spawn in caves underground, I lastly decided to give it a diamond pickaxe, and with that, the Rascal was finished. All in all, I was pretty pleased with the result of this one as well. Finally, we have the 2023 mob vote. This vote focused more on realistic animals instead of fantasy mobs like the previous votes. So this made it pretty easy to rebuild the mobs. The crab was based on the fiddler crab. It had an exotic blue and orange exterior with one comically large claw. I made the body blue and all the legs and claws were going to be orange. I added the eyes, then moved on to texturing the rest of the body. I had to make it as a realistic crab while still keeping it on brand with the Minecraft crab, which I pulled off mainly with the color scheme. Finally, I used slabs over the build to smooth it out. For the platform, I went with a similar underwater vibe like the first one in the video, adding seagrass and little sand patches around the podium, finishing off our second to last mob. And for our final mob, we have the penguin, which was based off of the rockhopper penguin. Shaping was pretty simple for this one, just a big blob with some wings on the side. I gave its feet a little walking motion and then I moved on to the head. I of course couldn't forget its iconic yellow eyebrows, which I created on one side and copied over to the other, doing the same thing for the eyes and then fixing all the shapes with some stairs and some fence gates. Finally, I did some shading for the body and used lots of white glass to make it look really soft and puffy. And lastly, I placed it in a snow blizzard atmosphere. A simple design, but it brought a lot of charm to this lineup. With that, I had built every single mob that lost the Minecraft mob votes, hopefully preserving their legacies as well. Here's a full showcase of them all on their own custom podiums. As always, if you want to build these for yourself, check out my Patreon link at the top of the description. Comment down below and let me know which one of these mobs do you wish had actually made it into the game. And as always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.